fellow pedophiles. I have loved history all my life, and it was a real joy to be able to be pastor in Maytown, basically my wider neighborhood, and it's such a historic place, and I really enjoyed finding out about things. As far as Simon Cameron goes, I've known him all my life, and he seems to follow me around or I him. I was born in Harrisburg, and of course those of you that know the city know that Cameron Street is one of the main thoroughfares in the town. We have a Cameron Parkway in South Harrisburg that would have led up to one of his mansion houses at one time. My grandparents lived in Harrisburg on 14th Street on top of Allison Hill, and right across the street was the Harrisburg Cemetery where Simon Cameron and his family are buried. And so it just seemed he was there all the time, and I come down to Maytown as the pastor, and I find out that I'm living in a house for 40 years there, our parsonage, which was given to our church because he was born on the site of our side yard in a log cabin there. And then I became a champion of Cameron, did a number of talks about him, and in 1989, no, it wouldn't have been that. 1999, on the anniversary of his birth, the 200th anniversary, I saw to a special celebration in honor of his birthday, and we had reenactors come and all of that kind of good stuff. And it was my plan to erect a monument in honor of Simon in his beloved Maytown. But unfortunately, I encountered opposition because, as some of you have already shared with me, Simon has a rather checkered reputation. And my basic point is that he was not that different from any other person I ever met in this life, especially politicians. Yeah, but also human beings, in that he is a mixture of good, bad, and indifferent. And if you accept that premise, then you can begin to see that this man was an incredible person. He did so much in his life that was absolutely amazing, and especially given his humble origin, which was dirt poor. Unfortunately, I couldn't do it. Money was also an issue, quite frankly. But then I left Maytown, and I retired in 2018, and went nuts until I finally got a position, a temporary position, as an interim pastor in Elliotsburg, Perry County, where one of my parishioners was a direct descendant of the Cameron family and had the Cameron name prior to her marriage. Wow. And I found out that there were a lot of Camerons in Perry County. Then, 2 years later, after the nightmare of COVID was beginning to wane, I was called to be the interim pastor at a small church, also in Perry County, in the northernmost reaches, outside of Liverpool. And there I discovered that there were Camerons all around also. And in Maytown, we had living there in the first 2 or 3 years of his life, someone who became another Maytown luminary, a fellow by the name of Cameron Mitchell, who later went on to become a Hollywood star in cowboy movies. Was the leading actor in the TV drama The High Chaparral, if you remember that. But was in a whole lot of other movies, was a buddy of Clark Gable and all of the other luminaries. But his name had been Cameron and was Cameron. He changed his last name to Mitchell. But it turns out that when he was a teenager, his father, who was a Reformed minister, had moved up to my area in Fouts Valley, Fouts being the maiden name of Simon Cameron's mother. And he graduated from our high school. So all these coincidences, I keep running across Cameron. But who was he? Well, what do you know about him?
Secretary of Treasury under Lincoln?
Secretary of what? Of War. Yes. Yeah. Anything else you know about him?
Built a summer home in Donington.
Did a what?
He built a summer home in Donington.
Yes. Well, he didn't build it so much as move into it and improve it. Yes.
He changed his politics.
Yes, he did. Yes, he did. Things were very much in a state of flux when he came on the scene. Yes. What else?
I've been in one of his homes on Cameron Street.
Yes. The Harris Mansion. Which is
No.
that
It's
was
another
that's
house.
his son's house, J. Donald Cameron.
Oh,
At
was
State
it?
Street and
No,
Front Street.
it was on Cameron. It was owned by the Karma Shops, who were Macedonian. Every room in that house had pocket doors.
Well,
It
it
sat
could be, but I'm not
slightly
quite
up
sure.
on a hill.
I'm not quite sure about
It
that.
was on Cameron.
Could be. There was one of their mansions was off Cameron Street, close to Steel, back in between where the Harrisburg East Mall is located now, and
Yeah,
then
that one
the incinerator area, where the Harrisburg incinerator is. Anyway, we've got a lot of stuff to cover here. So another thing, Dixie, if I go too long, and that's a distinct possibility, I'm famous for my long sermons, so you have to give me a high sign. Okay, Simon Cameron's origins. His great-grandfather was named Simon Daw, and he was a tenant farmer in Scotland and was on the losing side of the struggle between England and Scotland, largely fueled by the problems with the royal family and the fact that the Stuarts, who were Catholic, had been deprived of the English throne, and William and Mary had been made the monarchs of England, and then there were changes, and the Hanoverians, Germans, were invited to become the royal family. And so there was a lot of unrest for decades between the two, until the Battle of Culloden happened, and that more or less settled things on the English side of things. And so a lot of the farmers decided to emigrate to the New World, where they could get as far away from the English as possible. Even though they had championed the cause of the Catholic monarch and royal family, they were strict Presbyterians, and they did not get along with the Church of England that was seeking to run things, basically. And so they decided to come on boats over this country in large numbers, and many of them wound up in our area. And hence the various names of various townships in our area. Donegal, certainly, Raphoe, all these Irish, Scots-Irish names that came both from Scotland proper and from Northern Ireland. And so they settled here. Simon came rather late. We think maybe they got to the Donegal area around 1775. And so just before the Revolutionary War got really hot and heavy, and it was Simon and his son, or excuse me, I should say Donald was the original, and then his son Simon, and then his son Charles, who was a very young man when he arrived on these shores, having been born in Scotland. And also his uncle John. And then assorted other family members who came in the initial group. And they wound up in the area that is where Donegal Presbyterian Church is located now along Donegal Springs Road. And this had been an area where the original settlers had come en masse because there was a road right in front of the church that was called Great Peter's Road that Peter Bazalian, a trader with the Indians, had created himself, that stretched all the way from the Susquehanna River to the outskirts of Chester County. And he himself lived right over the border in Chester County. But anyhow, the Donegal Presbyterian Church had been erected there sometime around the 1720 era. And so they had been in existence now for a while. And there was a proper parsonage where their pastor would live. And so the Cameron family originally farmed for the pastor his land, and also what they called the glebe lands, which was the European term where the church owned land around it to earn income for its support. And so you had these very poor tenant farmers scraping a meager living around Donegal Church. Then the Revolution comes, and of course you all know about the witness tree business that happened out there. And the Scots-Irish were hot for the Revolution generally. My German forebears, not so much. I think the Germans largely felt, or to some extent felt, that you were just changing one English-speaking king for another one in George Washington. And they felt like second-class citizens because, of course, they spoke Deutsch. Their religion was Lutheran or Reformed or some of the plain sects, the Mennonites, and Brethren groups and all of that. And they were not in favor in many colonies. Now, Pennsylvania was unique, of course, because it was a Quaker place where William Penn had founded the colony as a holy experiment, and none of the groups were to be favored. But there still was that little element. And so the Germans were not as much on board as the Scots-Irish, but they were. And it's a little bit, I read various accounts to see whether or not the Camerons were actually in service, and I'm not 100% sure of the answer to that. I do think at least one or more of them were. But there were a number of them that came beyond the ones that I mentioned and settled in Maytown or the outskirts of Maytown. So anyhow, Charles Cameron had aspirations to get beyond farming. And so he came into Maytown, which was the largest population center in the township. I mean, we were there before any of you were. We were the metropolis of Donegal. And it was a going place. And so he became an apprentice to a tailor in town. But the trouble was, there were 7 other tailors in Maytown. And that made earning a living pretty darn tough. You know, back then people didn't have a lot of clothing. And so that made it really challenging. But anyhow, he tried his luck as a tailor. And he got married to a woman by the name of Martha Fouts. That's with a P and an F at the beginning. Good German name. And she hailed from her ancestors hailed both from Strasburg, Lancaster County, and from Perry County. And because, as I mentioned, we had Fouts Valley, and we have Fouts Valley up there. So apparently Martha was an incredible person in her spirit. She was very industrious, encouraged her family to be the best that they could, and they took the advice. They all had amazing lives. To scrape enough to feed her family, she resorted to all kinds of things, the most famous of which was that she would gather rags from the housewives in town, and then when she had enough of them, she would either sell them or make them into something that could be sold. And that was her contribution to the family. Now, her husband had pursued various careers. He tried to be a tailor for a while, as I said. He also tried to operate an inn in town. And he also was listed at the very end as a drover. But he really was not successful at anything commercially. The family moved about in several places in Maytown. I know of at least 3 houses that they lived in. One of which is the house that became 3 Center Square on the square, which was a restaurant in my time. Also up closer to our church on East High Street, there was a house. But the house that they lived in the longest and had the most kids in was a log house that was on West High Street in Maytown, number 8. And that was the house that eventually came to our church as a parsonage, as a brick house that was attached to the original log house. But he, like Abraham Lincoln, to whose destiny he was strongly attached, also were log cabin products. Simon was the 3rd child of the marriage. And so he was in the middle. And he was born on March 8th of 1799. So he just got in at the end of the 1700s. And he spent the next 9 years of his life living in Maytown. He had a great hunger for learning, but there weren't many opportunities for him. You may know that at that time, there was no public school system. There wasn't until the 1830s. And the only places you could get educated were at the churches. The Lutheran and the Reformed Church both had schools attached with them, but they were very small, and your families had to have the money to pay for it. So where he got this, I don't know, apparently from his parents, especially his mother. But he loved to read. And there's a story that's told about him in several places. And that has to do with the fact that he really wanted a particular book. Now, we don't know if this book was a geography or it might have been Don Quixote. That was the first book that we know he read. But he went to the general store in Maytown. It said Mr. Evans' store, but I have trouble believing that it was Evans. I think it might have been someone else's. But anyhow, he went there with money that his mother had given him from collecting these rags for a couple months. And to his horror, they wanted $1 for the book. And he only had 79 cents. And he started to cry, copious tears. And the kindly shopkeeper apparently said, "That's all right, Simon, you're a good boy. I'll let you have this book, and you can pay me back someday." He did. Big time. In fact, he became one of the richest men in the nation. Simon became. So anyhow, things were going along, scraping by, until 1808. Then there was a problem, and Charles Cameron went bankrupt. The sheriff of Lancaster County sold most of the family's belongings to pay debtors, and they were allowed to take just the basics along with them. They left town. They probably went to Falmouth, above the falls, and there they put in a raft. The whole family got on this raft, and they poled up the river 70 miles in 2 weeks, working at their poling during the day and sleeping on the riverbank at night. And they finally got to Sunbury, which was a thriving place back then. And things went even worse. They just couldn't find a way to assemble what was necessary to help their family out. Now, the sources vary a little bit as to whether or not it was in Sunbury or Lewisburg that the decision was made that the family had to be dissolved. But the parents realized they couldn't feed their children, and so they parceled them out to various families in the areas they care of. Simon was given to a medical doctor, Dr. Grahl, in Sunbury, who was a Jewish man who had, again, a very great interest in learning. And during Simon's residence with him, he tried to teach Simon medicine, but that didn't seem to go with Simon. He really wasn't caught up by that. But he also exposed him to books even more. He had a great library. And he had friends, amazing friends, one of whom was a man by the name of Lorenzo di Ponte. Did anyone ever hear that name before? Lorenzo di Ponte. No? No classical music lovers here? Lorenzo da Ponte was the author of many libretti that Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart used in his great musical works. And he was in Pennsylvania. And he met Simon Cameron as Cameron was a teenager. And they really enjoyed each other. So anyway, time passes. Simon turns 17. And he decides that medicine isn't his thing, but journalism and printing newspapers is. So he was apprenticed to a fellow by the name of Kennedy, who lived in Sunbury and printed the main newspaper there. And he stayed with him for a year until Kennedy himself had financial troubles and couldn't afford to take care of the paper or Simon. So Simon went from there to Harrisburg. And there he got involved with another paper. And by the age of 20, was the assistant editor of a Harrisburg newspaper. Then he heard that there was a paper in Montgomery County, in Doylestown, that needed a new editor, and he went there and bought the paper. But he realized very quickly that that wasn't going to earn him any money. And so he wound up in Washington for just a couple months, where he made connections, and Simon Cameron could make connections. That was his great gift. He read people like a book, and he could get them working together in various enterprises. From Washington, he came back to Harrisburg, and in very short order, he wound up marrying Margareta Bruja, a German Lutheran who was active in the same church that I was baptized in, Zion Lutheran Church in Harrisburg. And she was the daughter of Peter Bruja, who owned a department store in Harrisburg that was where Pomeroy's used to be, if you remember Pomeroy's. And he was a big whoop. And it so happened that a family connection, a close family connection, occurred where the governor of Pennsylvania, Andrew Schultz, was related to Mrs. Cameron, and because of that, Simon got the contract to print all Pennsylvania's paperwork. Lucrative. And after this, he engaged in some other enterprises, but eventually wound up being interested in canal building. Talk about a Renaissance man. And so he got a contract to create the Pennsylvania Canal along the Susquehanna River. Then he got a commission to organize 1,200 people in Philadelphia, put them on ships, sent them down to New Orleans, and they got off the ship when Simon and a couple other executives came down the Ohio River and Mississippi River system. And they wound up building a canal between Lake Pontchartrain and the Mississippi River that was considered the greatest engineering feat of its day prior to the Panama Canal. So, he's beginning to get a lot of money. But you know, technology continues, and before long, what replaces canals but railroads? So, Simon creates a railroad between Middletown and Lancaster. Then he sells the ground rights and the track to the Pennsylvania Railroad, which is the coming thing, the Pennsylvania Railroad. And they have to pay Simon and his associates $80,000 a year for 99 years. Wow. Now, Simon then does a couple things. He buys into 3 other railroads. He becomes the president of all of them, one of which is the North Central Railroad that goes from Baltimore to Harrisburg. And he begins to also invest in iron ore production. If any of you are familiar with my former area in Hempfield Township, Lancaster County, there is a place called Lake Grub. It's a lake now. Wasn't always a lake. It was an iron ore pit, a quarry. Who owned it? Simon Cameron. And he owned several other forges that produced pig iron and that kind of stuff. So he was incredible. Just continuing his financial odyssey before I talked about his politics a little bit. By 1835, he moved his family from Harrisburg, where they lived along Market Street, to Middletown, right near the square, on the main drag, east and west, 322, this, you know, your road. And he opened his bank. He owned a bank. And of course, he was the cashier of the bank. And so he had that money to invest in various projects of his. Meantime, of course, he and Margareta have produced a family. And it's a family that consists of about 7 kids. Actually, there's 10 all told, but 3 died in infancy. And one of them was J. Donald Cameron, who would later succeed him in the Senate. He had another son, Brua, who spent his life basically in the Middletown area. Another son that you don't hear about, Simon, who apparently was in some ways mentally incapacitated. And then there were a bunch of girls, all of whom married quite well, you know, and had fascinating careers just in and of themselves. So the family was growing, the wealth was growing, the projects were growing, and he wound up as the cashier of that bank for the next 20 years until he got bored. But he also was always interested in politics. And so when the Democratic Party, which was kind of the main party at that time, had its national convention in Baltimore in 1832, there was a fight as to who would be nominated to be vice president. The president was Andrew Jackson. And the guy that had been there before was not popular. And so Simon championed the cause of Martin Van Buren. And he was then chosen to be vice president. And just get my order right here. He was very involved in general politics at this time, Simon. In 1838, he was appointed to be on a commission that was supposed to settle a federal land dispute with the Winnebago Indians. You know, there were Winnebago Indians, they're not just trailers. And these Winnebago Indians had land in Wisconsin. And the federal government wanted it, and they were prepared to pay for it. And so he was appointed to settle things. And there's quite a controversy at this point in time exactly what happened. Some people take Cameron's side of the thing, some not. But somehow they wound up being paid, the Indians did, with script written on Cameron's bank that they then couldn't spend in Wisconsin. And so the Indians got to put up to them again, you know, like they always do. And there were also other things going on that I know it sounds horrible, but there were other things going on too that make it a little more even-handed. But nevertheless, that was the beginning of some of the controversy about Cameron and his methods. And he was called by his enemies then Chief Winnebago, which wasn't a compliment. So, anyhow, that happened in 1838. Then some more time passes, and in 1845, at that time, United States senators were not elected by popular vote. They were elected by the vote of the legislatures, the state legislatures. And so our senator, one of our senators was James Buchanan of Lancaster. Now, interestingly enough, Cameron and Buchanan had a back and forth relationship too. Cameron named one of his sons James Buchanan Cameron. And he apparently, one time Buchanan earlier in his life had given up on politics and decided to move to Baltimore to practice law there. But apparently Simon talked him out of that. And because of that, of course, he wound up ultimately being president of the United States. But anyway, so you've got Buchanan leaves to become James Polk's Secretary of State. So that leaves an opening. At that time, the Pennsylvania legislature was very narrowly divided. Nothing new under the sun, you know? And the majority, the slight majority, was in the hands of the Democrats. But there also were quite a few people that called themselves the American Party or the Know-Nothings. And the Know-Nothings and the American Party were similar, and it's both were people that took umbrage at all of the immigrants that were coming into the country, taking their jobs. Sound familiar? Mm-hmm. And they also were high tariff advocates, because Pennsylvania was the working place of the Union, where we had the factories and everything else, and we were afraid of foreign competition. And so these parties arose. They tended to be more conservative in their bent, and they were fairly evenly divided. So when Cameron's name came up, there was a movement to nominate him on the part of these others. Remember, he was a Democrat, but the others nominated him. And a few of what we would call the Calhoun Democrats, that is the more conservative Democrats, they voted along with the American Party. And that wound up giving Simon Cameron his first seat in the U.S. Senate. Now, it was a price because he had largely alienated his fellow Democrats by this. And there are all kinds of charges of bribery for votes and all of this kind of stuff. And none of which was ever proven, I might add. But it just left a bad taste in some people's mouths. Okay? So he was in the Senate then from 1845 to 1849, at which time the political winds changed. And the Democrats were back in a solid position, and they elected one of their own for the Senate seat. Time passed. Cameron is getting wealthier and wealthier. He's making more and more contacts with people throughout the Commonwealth and nation. And in 1857, a new phenomenon had come on the scene politically. Can anyone, for 10 points, name what that phenomenon is? Lincoln's party?
Whigs.
No, not the Whigs. The Whigs are past. Their day is past. The what? The Republican Party, yes. In 1856, they had their first convention in Chicago, where they nominated who for president? No, not Simon Cameron. Anyone know? A trivia question, all. John C. Fremont of California, the great pioneer and so forth. Cameron attended that convention. Obviously, he had decided that the Republicans were more, in his way of thinking, than the Democrats. Cameron, in terms of the issue of slavery, was against it. But he wasn't an abolitionist per se. he was never in his life what we would term a radical on anything. If anything, he was very practical, flexible, and he could work compromises with various groups and get things accomplished. He was not an ideologue in any way. But he did oppose slavery. He thought it was morally wrong, and he wasn't going to stop on behalf of receiving new states into the Union that were slave states. So anyhow, in 1857, with the Republicans coming on strong, and Pennsylvania being the heartland of republicanism, even though it was founded out in the Midwest, in Wisconsin, Pennsylvania was Republican, dyed in the wool. Why? Again, because Republicans favored high tariffs and were conservative, and Pennsylvania always seemed to fall into that category. So, when there was a vacancy in the Senate in 1857, who should be elected but Simon Cameron? And he was very, very popular at this time. Meanwhile, of course, the country's going to hell. And a young man named Abraham Lincoln is on the rise. So the Republicans gather for their second convention in Chicago, and there are several contestants for the nomination. One of them is Senator Seward of New York. New York's always an influential state. Seward of Alaska fame. Right. Well-known, well-thought-of, anti-slavery senator who was more on the defenses, or more on the barricades than Cameron ever would have been. Seward was probably the leading contender. Then there was Abe Lincoln. Then there was a man by the name of Salmon P. Chase, who was governor of Ohio. Then, who was the fourth? Yes! Our own Simon Cameron. He was the favorite son of Pennsylvania's delegation. And as I said, Pennsylvania was the keystone state. You know, we were significant. And so on the first ballot, Cameron wound up third. But that's as far as he went, because it was clear that outside of the Commonwealth, he really didn't have a following. So it came down basically to Seward and Lincoln, with some thought of Chase. And something happened that has since remained controversial, and nobody quite knows exactly what happened. But you know, at that time, the tradition was that candidates that were to be nominated stayed away from the convention until after they were nominated. Then they make their acceptance speech. Remember that? That used to be the way it was in our lifetimes. How things have changed. And so, Lincoln wasn't there in Chicago, but his operatives were. And don't think Abraham Lincoln was as pure as the driven snow. I mean, he knew politics too. So he had his operatives there working, trying to get people to deal. He had apparently told his chief operator not to make a deal, a hard and fast deal for a cabinet position with Simon Cameron, or really anybody else. But apparently they did. And they suggested to Cameron quite strongly that if he lent his support to Lincoln, he would get a cabinet post. He really wanted the Treasury, being a businessman, you know. But the Secretary of War was also open. Both very significant positions. And Lincoln knew that he had to name somebody from Pennsylvania to his cabinet. So, things happened. and Lincoln was nominated. But before he went to Washington on a train that had been organized by, of course, Simon Cameron, before he did that, he had some second thoughts about this, found out about the agreement, and actually wrote a letter to Cameron saying thanks but no thanks. And this really wounded Cameron's pride. It really was hurtful to him. But eventually, as things came out in the wash, after much grief and everything, by the time he got to Washington, Cameron was in. And then he was made Secretary of War. But of course, at the same time, the Confederates are bombarding Fort Sumter, and the Civil War is starting to break out. Cameron took two positions that got him into a lot of trouble, and the one actually wound up getting him kicked out of the cabinet after only 10 months of service. The one thing he did, he, above all other members of the cabinet, except for maybe Blair, knew that the North was facing a major problem because they hadn't mobilized their supplies and their troops to meet what he knew would be a challenge from the Confederates, led by most of the leading officers from West Point. So, when the Confederates captured the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad facilities, Harper's Ferry and other places, he used his own railroad, the North Central, to take a lot of war material to the front lines, which would have been Battle of Bull Run. And by the way, in Battle of Bull Run, one of Cameron's brothers, James, who was a colonel, was killed. Anyhow, because he used his own railroads, he obviously profited from this. And so people again said, aha, there's Simon, corrupt Simon, you know, trying to pull a fast one on us. And there were stories about horses being sold that were defective in some way. And again, the big problem, Doris Kearns Goodwin wrote a book about the convention and Lincoln's cabinet called The Team of Rivals, which I highly recommend if there's something to read here. It doesn't paint a very good picture of Simon, but the main thing it says about Simon is that he wasn't a very good organizer. For being as much of a genius as he was, he would write things down on a piece of paper and stuff them in his pocket and seemingly forget about it. So I think for one point in his life, he wasn't very effective at keeping control over all his agents who were really into patronage and exploiting the system. So anyhow, that happened. The other thing that happened was that Simon Cameron advocated freeing the slaves, Lincoln doing that, and using them in the fight against the South. Lincoln, if you know Lincoln, he was rather hesitant about doing those things. Only after the Battle of Antietam did he issue the Emancipation Proclamation in '62, after Cameron was gone. And Lincoln interpreted this as somehow undercutting him because Cameron was public about saying what he wanted to happen. So, another thing that happened at that time, and everybody who knows anything about Cameron knows this story. Thaddeus Stevens, a Lancaster congressman, okay, a lot of good things. He was very much an abolitionist, but he also was a bitter man, a man that could really hold grudges, and he was a man that did not like Simon Cameron and thought all the bad things about him. So, one time, in Lincoln's presence, he said, "Oh, that's Simon Cameron. The only thing he wouldn't steal is a red-hot stove. Well, of course, this got back to Cameron, and he went and demanded a retraction. Now, I might add that Cameron was involved in several duel situations at this time. Dueling was not that rare earlier in the 19th century. None of them wound up actually coming into fruition, but they came pretty darn close. And I wouldn't have been surprised if that wound up this way, but it didn't. So anyhow, he confronted Thaddeus Stevens with this. And Thaddeus Stevens, who was quite a wit with words. You know, Cameron was never too word, despite the fact that he loved to read. He was not a writer, he was not an orator, he was somebody that got things done. So anyhow, Thaddeus Stevens is reported to have said, I repent, I take back what I said about you. You would steal a red hot stove. Somehow he got away with it without Cameron nailing it. And actually, when Cameron was in the Senate, you know, there were a lot of stories back then before the Civil War started, when people would, senators would fight each other, physically fight each other on the floor of the Senate. You think it's bad today?
Oh, no.
I mean, one guy almost got killed, Charles Sumner, by one of his colleagues beating him with a cane until he was like pulp. Well, Cameron was attacked one day by a Southerner also, and he had to make arrangements with 3 other Northern senators to come to his aid if it happened again. So anyhow, Cameron then was in the Senate. The Civil War had started. He was now in the cabinet of Lincoln, and these things happened, and it was too much for Lincoln. And Cameron was too embarrassed by everything that was being said about him. And so they found a way to have him gently back out of the limelight. And so Abraham Lincoln made a deal with him. And the deal was, first of all, he would listen to what Cameron had to say as to who would replace him as Secretary of War. And so you all know that Edwin Stanton was chosen for the duration of the war. He did a decent job. Where was Edwin Stanton from, by the way?
Virginia.
Huh?
Pennsylvania.
Where? Pennsylvania. He was a Philadelphia lawyer. Obviously, buddy of Cameron. The other part of the deal was that Cameron would be appointed to be United States ambassador to the court of Tsar Alexander II, who had freed the slaves in Russia. Now, this was not something that Cameron necessarily wanted to do, even though he loved to travel his whole life long. He was kind of like an American of that time, of the Gilded Era. Why do you go to Europe? To collect all the culture you could with your dollars and bring them back to the U.S. and put them in your mansion. That's what they did back then. The Grand Tour of Europe, they called it. So anyhow, that's what he spent most of his brief tenure doing, traveling throughout Europe and picking up things that he and his wife. And, but he was there a while, and he was successful in keeping Russia out of the war on the side of the Confederacy, which also encouraged England and France to stay out also. And there had been some thought about doing that. So he was able to do that. While he was in St. Petersburg, his charge of legation, the guy right under him, was a man by the name of Byron Taylor, whose roots were where?
Pennsylvania.
Yes, but where exactly? Maytown! Yes! You go to the Reformed Church, they've got a window in honor of him. You go out back, there's a monument, we named a street after him. He was the Lowell Thomas of his day. He traveled when other people didn't, to exotic places. He was a wonderful poet all his life. Magnificent poetry. He was a friend of Whittier and all the great poets of New England. In fact, Whittier wrote an ode on the occasion of his death. So he was very well thought of. He made his money by doing what I'm doing, lecturing, like Mark Twain did. You know, that was his. He also became, as I say, a foreign servant, and after he left St. Petersburg, he was the American ambassador to the German Imperial Court. And he was an authority on German literature, and he translated the works of Goethe, the greatest German writer. So he made the authoritative English version of Goethe's works. And he was from Maytown. His family was from Maytown. So, anyway, it turned out he was there. A Donegal was with a Donegal in St. Petersburg. By the way, I'm thinking of Donegal. Simon Cameron loved Maytown. For him, it was the best place on earth. But he identified himself as a Donegaler. And when his son tried to come to a party that he was throwing at the mansion, Donegal Springs, he said, "You ain't no Donegaler." He had been raised. He said, "My son has many advantages. Went to the finest schools, Princeton and so forth, and he has one disadvantage. He was never poor like me." So he didn't have that hunger in his gut. So, anyhow, so where are we now in our progression? Okay, so he came back from Europe, and he had to have a grand house. Now, I should say that after he left Middletown, he had a mansion briefly in that area where the Harrisburg incinerator is. It was a fairly grand place with a wraparound porch and velvet on the walls and fancy staircase and marble fireplaces and all that, but not a place to fit in of someone of his stature. And so he decided to buy the Harris Mansion on Front Street in Harrisburg, which is a nice stone Georgian mansion. If you haven't been there, I highly recommend you go. And so he fixed it up, of course, quite a bit. Yeah. But so he moved in there, and he continued his behind-the-scenes work. And in 1864, there was a problem in the country because after this long civil war, the country was tired of it. And there was a movement, even in the Republican Party, to maybe make peace with the rebels. The Democratic Party had really gone in that direction. But the Republicans were divided, and most Republicans wanted to continue it, but they weren't so sure if Lincoln was the guy to do it. So, Simon Cameron heard about this, and he drafted a letter of support for Abraham Lincoln's candidacy and renomination. And every single Republican member of the General Assembly signed it.
Wow.
And with Pennsylvania's backing in the corner,
Lincoln.
he was renominated. So if you think about it, Simon Cameron's action saved not only Lincoln, but saved the country. That the war continued until the North won, and things were put back together again. Little things can have big effects. Anyway, we all know what happened to Lincoln. And then in 1866, Cameron came back into the Senate. And while in the Senate, he had a fairly distinguished career, but again, he wasn't an orator, he wasn't a writer. He was the guy that got things done behind the scenes. He created alliances to accomplish various things. His big deal was what we call in history manifest destiny. You know what that means? What does that mean? Anyone want to tell me what that? You ever heard that phrase?
From the Atlantic to the Mississippi.
Yeah, in other words, expansion throughout the continent. The American drive to fill up the continent, you know. And so he was a big supporter of the transcontinental railroad. Of course, railroads, Cameron. And he was also a very strong advocate of making territories into states. And so he was behind that. And because of that, a lot of counties in the United States, in far-flung areas, are called Cameron County. Yeah. We have Cameron County in Pennsylvania named after him, right? So, he also became the chairman of the Senate Foreign Service, or Foreign Affairs Committee, which was a very responsible position. And so he thrived, but he was getting older. You know, he was born in 1799, and now we're up to 1867, or 1877. And he's tired. But he can't let go entirely. So, when he resigns, he asks the Pennsylvania Senate to name his son, J. Donald Cameron, as his successor. And from then on, the Pennsylvania legislature was called the Cameron Transfer Company. So, and J. Donald then had a long career in the Senate and was quite an influential figure. Although, after Simon died, the reins of the political machine that Cameron had created in the Commonwealth that ran everything, that went to Matt Quay, who was a lieutenant of Simon Cameron's, not his son's batch. So, 1877. Now, just before that, when he left the Senate, in 1872 or 3, he decided that he was going to buy the farm that his ancestors had to work as tenant farmers at Donegal Church. And so he bought what today is called the Cameron Estate Manor or whatever. And it had been in the Watson family, Dr. Watson's family, for 3 or 4 generations. But it came available, and so he bought it. And in the meantime, he began to buy farms. Until he was done, he owned 1,200 acres in Lancaster County, 9 farms. And also farms in Dauphin County that were kept in the family for quite a while. He began to develop his estate, and he got in a pattern of coming down here in the summertime and living in Harrisburg or Washington or traveling throughout the world as a regular part of his life in retirement. The old timers here may remember that Donegal Springs Road used to have lovely overarching trees that gave you wonderful shade. Then you could go back to Donegal and go behind the church to the pond there and dip your feet in the cold water or drink it. And he raised trout in his fishery, developing that breed. He also was a great animal husbandry man. He raised prize cattle that were the envy of everybody. And his favorite crop, of course, being a cash person in Lancaster County, was tobacco. Yes. And so he had quite a wonderful estate there. And it reminded him of a lot of places in Europe. That's why he created that overarching thing that unfortunately isn't there anymore. But anyhow, so, and then the next year, after they acquired the mansion, didn't Margaretta die? He really loved her. He really loved her. And he just couldn't bear the thought of not having her there. But, nevertheless, it is a matter of historic lore in Maytown that he would come to Maytown on an almost daily basis, at least weekly. And he had his own room in one of our hotels, the Temperance Hotel. And he would have his lady friends come by. He apparently had 3 Annies. They were all named Annie. And very kind to them, of course, bestowed upon them all kinds of nice gifts. And there is also a story, rather humorous, that one of my members in Maytown's mother went to a gathering of ladies, I don't know, a card club or something like that. And they were giggling a lot, and they were showing each other's pictures, and they showed a picture of the one woman's husband when he was younger, and even more recently. And she said, "You know, that looks like Simon Cameron." Oh. And she said, "That's my husband." And the rumor always had been that his mother had been one of the Annies. So, who knows? Who knows? Stranger things have happened. But he also was a great benefactor of Maytown. He gave my church, the parsonage, the site of where he'd been born. He gave the Reformed Church their parsonage. He beautified the town square, put a fence around it, and an iron pump in the middle of it, not the one that's there now. And he planted the tulip poplar tree that's still there, growing in the center of town. He also was somebody who looked after the widows in the area, not in the way that you might think necessarily, but he provided coal for them in the wintertime when they didn't have sufficient reserves to heat their homes. So he had a very strong community sense, and as I say, he loved Maytown. It was the best place in the world. So he lived there then in retirement. He still had his political friends come by. A frequent visitor was someone that you may know of. Ulysses Simpson Grant was a frequent visitor. And a lot of other politicals that you would know the names of came there for advice and other things. And of course, to get their votes, they had to come to Simon Cameron. So, what were his days of retirement like? We even know this, amazing. He would get up about 7 or 8 o'clock in the morning, and he would have a normal kind of breakfast, egg, possibly some kind of meat, just the basic things that we're familiar with. Then he would tend to some business, and at 11 o'clock, without fail, he would drink a quart of champagne. Clico Club. Remember Clico Club, that brand name? They made champagne. And he loved it. He attributed it to his long life. Who knows? For lunch, he would have a roast beef or something like that, vegetables, and he would top it off with his favorite dessert, which was baked apples. He never ate pie because he said that like the only pie eaters like the young die young. Or the good, pie eaters and the good die young. And he said this a lot of times. He apparently lived by that. Then he would take a nap, a 45-minute nap. And the rest of the afternoon, he would entertain visitors, go into Maytown for various things. He he would sit in his library and read. He has a tremendous library. I even have two of his books that he has signed on, and our Historical Society has his copy of the Constitution. He would then, at the normal dinner hour, have a very small meal that usually consisted of either mush with milk, bread with milk, or grits, possibly oatmeal. So, I mean, very simple, reflecting both probably his own philosophy on what was good for him, and also his poverty, quite frankly, that was never far from his awareness. And then he would go to bed at 8, but he would read until 11 o'clock, at which time he would go to bed. Now, the end of his life. In June of 1889, first of all, in March, he had celebrated his 90th birthday in Harrisburg, and we have a picture of him sitting on his front porch, the mansion there, and every member, Republican and Democrat, of the legislature marched from the Capitol to his house to present greetings to him. And so then later on in the summer, he came down to Donegal Springs, as was his custom. And on the day, and it was June 20th, he had been showing signs of having problems. Apparently he owned a Colonel Duffy from Marietta, who was a buddy of his, had died, and his widow left Simon this rolling chair that he could sit on, and I guess a manservant could push him around even on the lawn to supervise things. Because Simon had to supervise something, you know. And so he had been doing this, but he had also been exhibiting some signs of maybe there was a problem there. But anyhow, on the 20th, he had his normal breakfast and lunch, and then he sent his manservant, John Campbell, who was a black man, into Maytown to the post office to get his mail and find out the local gossip of what was going on in town. The guy he went to was a man by the name of Haynes, Henry Haynes. The Haynes family lived in Maytown since 1800 and still owned a house there, I might add. And this lovely stone house on the town square was where he got the mail. When he got back to Donegal Springs, he found his employer sitting down, looking sort of like Biden does now at times, just kind of somewhere else, not there. And he was rubbing his right hand with his left hand, and he couldn't move his arm or his leg. His right side was paralyzed. And worst of all for Simon, he couldn't talk. So it was obvious that he had suffered a major, major stroke. They called it different things back then, but that's what had happened to him. And so the family was called in, and he became front page news for the next 6 days around the nation. At that time, the only telegraph was in Marietta. So that caused some problems until they made a line out closer to the house that the press corps could use to convey moment by moment what was happening to the great man, the sage of Donegal. And things were not good. Every day was kind of bad. He really couldn't eat except a little bit of brandy and milk. And one day, the story goes that Simon, because he was so interested in horticulture and everything like that, he always selected red roses. And somebody tried to give him a white rose, and he let it drop. Wasn't interested in it. But then they gave him a red rose, and he really was able to smell it and seemed like he really was into it. So he did have some minor sense of what was going on in his last days. But, as happens to us all, around 8 o'clock at night, in the presence of his family and a couple doctors, one from Maytown, one from Philadelphia, he died. And the next day, he was taken by carriage down to Marietta to a funeral parlor there, the Boyd's funeral parlor. And they apparently embalmed him at that time. And then he was put on a special train that had been organized just for him. And that took his body to Harrisburg the next day. And then it was moved in a hearse from the train station to his Front Street home. And the next day they had the funeral service at the mansion, in the ballroom of the mansion. The Presbyterian minister at Pine Street Presbyterian Church in Harrisburg, which was one of the two status churches in the city. He was the leader of the service, and the other leader of the service was the Lutheran pastor, Pastor Hay, who had connections with Zion and our seminary in Gettysburg. There was a quartet of men that sang familiar hymns, Abide With Me, and Jesus, Lover of My Soul. And after that, he was taken again by hearse to the Harrisburg Cemetery, where he was laid to rest with the rest of his family underneath an obelisk there, and you can go and see that today. Now, Cameron was, as I say, a figure that is very diverse, had a lot of good, a lot of bad, everything in between, like all of us. His theology, I think he was a good churchman. I think his theology is impeccable, because they were asking him, he came to Elizabethtown one time, they were always giving him dinners in honor of some such thing or whatever. And he came to Elizabethtown, and he was, I guess, in the mood to kind of be reflective and everything about his long life. And he said, you know, you can't live a life as long as I have and done as many things as I've done without making enemies. And he said it's just one of those things. But he nevertheless hoped that when he died, people would say of him that he tried to do his best with what he had been given. And he also said that he never looked to his own righteousness for his hope, but rather God's forgiveness in all things. So he was a pretty good guy down deep inside, and did a lot of, as we say, amazing things. I mean, I filled up this time. I know I probably went way over your usual time, but I couldn't avoid it because he had done so many things, and because I'm myself.
He never had any higher education, did he?
No, no. It was all self-taught. He was inspired by, obviously, his mother and by the Jewish doctor and probably the newspaper people that he had worked with.
The people that.
But he just was an amazing, amazing person in so many ways. And if you want inspiration, it just, yeah. Yeah, any questions?
Yeah, did you ever say how and why he came to Harrisburg from Sunbury?
Newspaper.
Yeah.
Well, that's what I mean, that's, I don't know, presumably yes, that he heard that there was an opening. That would be my guess, but I haven't seen it written anyway, that's what actually drove him. I mean, clearly his roots were down here in this area. And clearly being interested in politics, which he always was, you know, you come to the capital of Pennsylvania, that's where you have politics. And he got his son, as I say, involved heavily too. In fact, his son, on one of the days that he was elected, his son, when he was in town, he would attend all the sessions of the legislature. he wasn't a member at the time, or ever of the Pennsylvania legislature, but he would go to all their meetings. And his son was there one day, and he was so enthused that his father had been elected or something, whatever, that he couldn't wait to get to the door. He jumped out the window and ran all the way home to tell his dad the good news. Yeah.
You said he was the third. Four.
Yeah.
Out of how many? How many siblings did you have?
7, 8. It's a little bit fuzzy to me.
And the motivation for that doctor to take him in, was that extraordinary or?
No, you get free labor. They can be your, because you had indentured yourself
Right.
to the person.
Okay.
And so then they had to let you out of that indenture.
So it wasn't just magnanimity, it was just the guy's part.
No, but he was apparently a well-known figure in Sunbury, and doctors generally are pretty benevolent, I think, by my experience. So,
Thank you.
yeah.
Thank you, Rob.